The bells of St. Mary Mead tolled softly, their chimes swallowed by the rustling leaves and the murmur of assembled guests. It was the kind of day poets might write about, sunlight filtering through the high stained glass windows of the church, a warm breeze carrying the scent of roses and fresh-cut grass, and a bride standing at the altar, radiant in her beauty. A picture-perfect wedding. But beneath the idyllic scene, something was amiss. It wasn't in the flowers, which were arranged in perfect harmony, nor in the music, which played sweetly through the chapel. It was in the people, the stolen glances, the slight hesitations, the murmurs just a touch too hushed. Something unseen yet undeniable lingered in the air. Miss Marple, seated quietly near the back, adjusted her spectacles and observed. She had always believed that human nature, even in its best attire, never truly hid itself. And today she could sense an undercurrent, something just below the surface. This was not just a wedding. This was something else entirely. The village of St. Mary Mead was not a place that welcomed change easily. Its old stone cottages, black and white against the rolling greenery, seemed trapped in time. The cobbled streets twisted like veins through its heart, leading to the small parish church, where the past and present seemed to merge. Today, however, the village was alive with celebration. The churchyard was bursting with color. Roses, lilies, and fresh bouquets carefully arranged for the grand occasion. A few local boys, dressed in their best knickerbockers and jackets, darted between the hedges, their laughter mingling with the soft hum of whispered conversations. At the center of it all stood Clarissa Blackwood, the bride. She was breathtaking in her gown of ivory lace, the embroidery so delicate it seemed to breathe with her every movement. Her auburn hair was drawn into an intricate knot at the nape of her neck, crowned with a veil as sheer as morning mist. From a distance, she was the very image of a blissful bride. But Miss Marple had always known that appearances could be deceiving. There was something in Clarissa's eyes, an almost imperceptible flicker of tension, as if her mind were elsewhere, as if her lips smiled but her heart did not. Beside her stood Jonathan Blackwood, the groom. Tall, broad-shouldered, and strikingly handsome, he looked every inch the man of wealth and privilege. His dark suit was immaculately tailored, his shoes polished to perfection, and yet despite the grandeur of the day, he stood stiff, his posture rigid, his jaw clenched just a little too tightly. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the best man, Henry Lyle, a stark contrast to Jonathan. Henry was wiry, almost gaunt, with the look of a man who had carried burdens far heavier than most. There was a melancholy about him, a quiet sadness that lingered in his eyes. But more than that, there was something else. His gaze, fleeting yet unmistakable, lingered on Clarissa just a second too long. He masked it well, his lips curving into a polite smile, but Miss Marple was not fooled. She had seen that look before. The look of a man who wanted something or someone he could not have. Miss Marple sat quietly in her seat, her small frame nearly lost among the more extravagant guests. Her gray hair was pinned neatly into a bun, her glasses perched delicately on the bridge of her nose. She did not speak much, nor did she attempt to make herself noticed. Instead she observed the way Clarissa's fingers clutched her bouquet, as if anchoring herself. The way Jonathan's hands clenched into fists, then relaxed, then clenched again. The way Henry's gaze wavered, though he tried to remain indifferent. Beautiful day, isn't it? A voice beside her broke her train of thought. Miss Marple turned slightly, and found herself looking at Mrs. Forey, an elderly widow who had lived in St. Mary Mead for longer than Miss Marple could remember. She was the sort of woman who had a talent for speaking precisely when silence was preferred. Yes, Miss Marple replied, her voice gentle but thoughtful. Very fitting for a wedding. Mrs. Forey glanced towards the altar, where Jonathan and Clarissa stood. She sighed, shaking her head slightly. Poor Jonathan, she murmured. He doesn't look happy, does he? Miss Marple's sharp gaze flickered over the groom. No, he didn't. He doesn't, she agreed quietly. Forey leaned in conspiratorially, lowering her voice. You know, I hear there's been some trouble between him and Henry. The two of them always in competition. And don't tell anyone I said that. I won't, Miss Marple assured her. And she meant it. She was not here to spread rumors. She was here to listen, to watch. And already she had seen quite a bit. The ceremony went on, the solemn words of matrimony filling the chapel. Jonathan Blackwood's voice was steady as he recited his vows, but his eyes remained distant. When it came time to kiss the bride, his lips met Clarissa's in a chaste embrace, but Miss Marple noticed something peculiar. Clarissa's eyes, for the briefest of moments as Jonathan pulled away, her gaze flickered past him, past the guests, past the priest, past the flowers. She was looking at something, or someone. Miss Marple's fingers tightened ever so slightly around the fabric of her handbag. Perhaps she was mistaken. Or perhaps this wedding was not the fairy tale it appeared to be. And if there was one thing Miss Marple had learned over the years, it was this: secrets, no matter how carefully hidden, always found a way to the surface. Guests clapped and the bells rang, but there was an undeniable shift in the air, as though the day's joy had been tainted by something darker. Just beneath the surface, as the newlyweds made their way out of the church, Henry lingered behind, casting an unreadable glance toward the bride. Miss Marple noticed it. Her sharp eyes caught the way his jaw clenched for just a moment, how his hand twitched as though he were about to reach out to her, but stopped himself. Something was off. The guests, though cheering for the couple, weren't entirely convinced of the spectacle. Whispers fluttered about behind closed mouths. A few eyes darted in Clarissa's direction, perhaps out of envy, or perhaps out of something darker. And yet the scene was painted perfectly, in the warm afternoon light. A scene of joy, a scene of celebration. But Miss Marple knew better. She had seen enough of human nature to understand that nothing was ever as it seemed, especially not in a place like St. Mary. The wedding would end, the guests would depart, and life would carry on. But Miss Marple would remain. She was already certain that something far more insidious than jealousy was at play. There were motives to be uncovered and lies to be unearthed. And if there was one thing she knew, it was that St. Mary Me always had its share of secret. And Miss Marple, she was good at finding them. The sun had dipped lower behind the horizon, casting a warm amber glow over St. Mary Me. The quiet hum of conversation was muffled by the sound of distant church bells still ringing their celebratory chimes for Clarissa and Jonathan Blackwood's wedding. The church's heavy wooden doors had been thrown open, allowing the steady stream of guests to spill out into the manicured G-garden, like water over a spillway. Laughter, light and hollow, bounced off the stone walls of the chapel and mingled with the scent of fresh flowers that clung to the air. It was the perfect image of a village celebrating a perfect union. Miss Marple, however, wasn't one for illusions. She took a moment to step back from the crow, observing from the corner of her eye as Clarissa, flushed, beaming, slipped away toward the rear of the church. She was heading for the bridal suite, likely to collect herself before the evening's reception. The flurry of lace and silk trailed behind her as she disappeared into the side passage leading to the manor's wing. Clarissa's departure was brief, but telling. From across the garden, Miss Marple's sharp gaze caught the lingering look from Henry Lie. It wasn't a look one could easily explain. It was too long, too deliberate, a glance that could have burned holes through the back of the bride's veil, if Henry had only known how to control it. His face, usually so carefully composed, twitched with something almost painful. His eyes followed Clarissa's every step, the kind of stare that said there was unfinished business. Miss Marple recognized it instantly, the kind of unresolved emotion that only came from one thing: jealousy. She wasn't fooled by the perfectly neat suit or the gentle smile he flashed at the guests. There was a storm inside that man, even if it didn't show in the way he spoke or the way he greeted people with a firm handshake. Miss Marple leaned slightly on her cane, her thin lips curling upward, not in amusement, but in quiet acknowledgement. "I've seen that look before," she murmured under her breath. "Not that it's a rare thing." Her voice, soft and steady, went unnoticed by the crowd, but a few of the closer guests gave her a polite glance as they passed. They knew her. Miss Marple was always in the background, always watching, always a quiet fixture in a village of noise. They didn't mind her presence, but they didn't know the sharpness of her mind. They didn't understand that she noticed things they didn't. People thought they had mastered the art of hiding their feelings in a place like St. Marry Me. But they hadn't. Miss Marple's attention returned to Henry, who had finally turned away from the direction in which Clarissa had disappeared. His back straight but his movements tight. The briefest of moments had passed, but the weight of it was enough to speak volumes. She turned slowly and started walking back toward the reception. There was nothing to be done about it now. The bride had taken her leave, and Henry had his own demons to wrestle. She'd let the moment linger in her mind, and she'd wait as she moved. The chatter of the guests continue, at unabated, half-hearted compliments on the flowers, a whispered remark about Jonathan's distant look, and snippets of gossip. All the same, just another wedding in another small village. Miss Marple, however, knew better. The house would be full of guests now, and her presence would go unnoticed in the throng. The reception hall was a cavern of opulence. Tall vaulted ceilings rose over 100 guests sipping champagne and nibbling at their food served on trays by the manor staff. Candles flickered in large brass holders, their flames dancing like little flames of doubt. The floor gleamed under the soft light, and the walls were decorated with mirrors and tapestries, their colors muted by age, but still regal. St. Marry Me's small-town charm had been polished into something grand thanks to the Blackwoods' considerable fortune. It was a world where appearance mattered more than reality. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the room. She'd seen enough of these places in her time to know that the facade never stood up to scrutiny. People walked with an air of confidence, but every one of them had something to hide. The older women chatted quietly. The men congregated by the bar, their voices rising with each drink. The younger women flitted like butterflies from one conversation to the next, their eyes occasionally flicking toward the new couple whose every move was under constant observation. Jonathan stood beside his bride, his hand lightly placed on her waist, but his eyes were distant, as if they were focusing on something far off beyond the room, beyond the festivities. His gaze flickered to Henry once or twice, but he said nothing. Nothing more than the occasional pleasantries passed between the two men. It was a cordial silence, one that only served to make the tension between them more palpable. Miss Marple's mind began to turn over the facts, drawing invisible lines between the moments, between the people. She could sense that something was coming, something unexpected. Perhaps she was wrong. Maybe nothing would happen, but in her bones she knew otherwise. "Miss Marple, dear," a voice interrupted her thoughts. It was Mrs. Forey again, her hand fluttering in the air like a pigeon, trying to take flight. "But have you seen the bride? She's disappeared, you know, just up and left like a ghost. Maybe she's gone to rest." Miss Marple said, her voice smooth and unruffled. "It's quite an exhausting day after all." Mrs. Forey peered at her eyes wide with suspicion. "You think so? I've heard rumors about the Blackwoods. You know, I've heard that Henry Lyle might not be as fond of his friend Jonathan as he lets on. Aren't we all fond of someone in our own way?" Miss Marple replied, dry as dust. "Especially when it serves our purpose." Mrs. Forsyte's smile was tight, as if unsure whether she'd been complimented or dismissed. Meanwhile, Henry stood across the room, leaning against a column, drink in hand. He wasn't the center of attention. He rarely was, but he wasn't entirely forgotten either. He caught Miss Marple's gaze from across the room, a flicker of recognition, and then a smile. It was calculated, too forced to be genuine, a social mask. She didn't smile back, though she could feel the weight of his gaze on her like a pressure. And there it was, the smallest of clues. The way he'd looked at her, like a man who knew he was being watched. The tiniest hint of anxiety bled through his composure. Miss Marple turned back toward the window, watching the faint shadows stretch long across the grounds. The village was quiet again, but the wind was shifting. Something was coming. She didn't need to hurry. Not yet, but she could feel the undercurrent, like the low, rumble of thunder in the distance, and soon it would break. And when it did, Miss Marple would be ready. The evening wore on with a slow, steady rhythm. The village hall, decked with garlands of fresh ivy and gleaming brass candelabras, was filled with the clink of champagne glasses and the murmur of polite conversation. The wedding guests had grown more relaxed, their smiles becoming less rehearsed as the drinks took hold. Laughter, soft at first, bubbled up from small clusters of people, but there was a quiet undercurrent to the affair, something that didn't quite sit right. Miss Marple had been observing the crowd with the usual cool detachment. She had never been one to join in the festivities, preferring to remain in the background, quiet, unobtrusive, yet always watching. Her eyes flicked from one guest to the next, taking in every subtle gesture, every faint flicker of emotion. The room smelled of roses, polished wood, and faint traces of something sharp, perhaps the perfume of a guest who'd overdone it. Clarissa, the bride, had disappeared from the festivities earlier, slipping away quietly, no doubt to catch her breath before the evening's next stage. At least that's what the others assumed. But it was some time before anyone. Billy noticed that she hadn't returned. The murmur started quietly. At first it was one or two guests speculating where she could have gone, perhaps to freshen up, perhaps to talk to Jonathan in private. But the longer it stretched on, the more concerned they became. By the time the village constables were called, the whispers had turned into a flurry of anxious voices. Miss Marple was one of the first to hear the commotion as she was standing near the back of the hall sipping her glass of seltzer. She caught the nervous shuffle of feet, the half-whispered questions that fluttered. From group to group she made her way through the crowd, the slight pressure of the cane in her hand the only sound accompanying her movement. No one noticed her approach. They were too busy scouring the room for any sign of Clarissa. The constables arrived shortly after. A couple of them had been working the village for years, but their faces were tight with unease, the kind of discomfort that came from being caught up in something they didn't quite understand. Miss Marple stepped forward, a voice soft but firm. "What's happened, officer?" One of the constables, a young man named Kane, looked up at her. His brow furrowed. "Miss Marple, it's the bride. She's gone missing. No one's seen her since she left to freshen up. We've searched the grounds, nothing." The seriousness of the situation settled on the room like a thick fog, and Miss Marple knew without any doubt that the game had changed. "I'll take a look, Miss Marple," said her voice, even betraying nothing of the anxiety she felt tightening in her chest. The constables didn't protest. In fact, they were glad to have her assistance despite her age. Miss Marple had a reputation for solving the sorts of mysteries that stumped people far younger than she. She made her way to the bridal suite, the constables trailing behind her as they reached the door to the suite. The first thing Miss Marple noticed was the quiet. The room was still, too. Still, the low hum of the festivities had faded to nothing, as if the house itself were holding its breath. She could see the heater in the corner of the room still running, with the soft hiss of steam rising from its pipes. There was no sign of struggle. The door to the suite was locked from the inside. A quick examination of the room revealed little of immediate interest. Antique furniture sat neatly in place, untouched. The lace curtains, drawn tight, cast long shadows over the space. But it was the air of the room that caught Miss Marple's attention. A faint cloying scent of perfume mixed with something sharp, bitter, almost chemical. It was subtle but not enough to be ignored. Her eyes moved to the bed. There, amid the soft fabric of the sheets, was Clarissa. A body lay on the bed, her hand frozen mid-motion, as though she had been reaching for something. Her face, once radiant, was now unnaturally pale, her lips tinged with the faintest shade of purple. The way she lay, slightly askew, suggested something more than just a sudden collapse. It was as if she had been caught in the middle of something, perhaps a desperate movement, a final struggle. "She's dead," said Constable Kane, his voice a tight whisper. Miss Marple didn't need the confirmation. The room, though charming in its disur, had the look of a trap, calm and silent on the surface, but underneath something had gone terribly wrong. A sharp breath escaped Miss Marple's lips as she stepped closer to the body. She didn't touch anything, but her eyes swept over the small details that everyone else had missed. The bouquet that Clarissa had carried was now lying beside the bed, discarded like an afterthought. A faint hint of perfume in the air mingling with the bitter scent lingered in the back of her mind. She'd smelled something like it before, but she couldn't place it yet. The room was locked from the inside. No one had entered, but someone had made sure that no one would see the crime until it was too late. Kane had stepped up beside her. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide with the same unease that had taken hold of the rest of the guests. How could she have been killed in here? Miss Mell, the door was locked. There's no sign of anyone entering or leaving. It doesn't make sense. Miss Marple looked over the room again, her eyes narrowing as she processed the scene. Her mind moving quickly over the facts. She turned slowly, the weight of the situation settling like an unwelcome guest. "No, it doesn't make sense," she murmured. "But nothing here is quite what it seems, is it?" She stepped away from the body, her mind already spinning with possibilities, each more complicated than the last. The locked room, the bitter scent, the body on the bed. It wasn't just a death. It was a message. Whoever had done this knew the house, knew how to leave. No trace, knew exactly how to make the crime appear. "Impossible." Miss Marple turned toward the constables, her voice calm. "We need to examine everything. The body, the perfume, the door. It all leads somewhere. And I suspect the answer is far closer to us than we think." The constables exchanged uneasy glances. There was no doubt in their minds. Now this wasn't just a disappearance. It was murder, and with a murderer in their midst. The game had only just begun. The village of St. Mary was quiet again. The guests had long since left the hall, and the celebration had turned to whispers, leaving the manor in the grip of an oppressive stillness inside the bridal suite. The muted silence lingered, broken only by the occasional creak of wood in the old house or the soft hiss of the heater still running. The constables had retreated, giving Miss Marple space to examine the scene further. They weren't sure what to make of it. Neither were the guests, but Miss Marple had already begun to see past the superficial calm. Her sharp eyes missed nothing. The shattered champagne glass on the table had caught her attention first, its delicate stem still half buried in the white lace of the tablecloth. But it wasn't the break that held Miss Marple's gaze. It was what was left behind. She bent forward slightly, her cane tapping softly against the wooden floor as she moved closer to the table. The rim of the glass glistened faintly under the light, revealing a trace of something that wasn't just the typical residue of spilled champagne. A slick, thin line of something darker, almost oily in texture, lingered just beneath the lip. A poison. It was the only explanation. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She didn't touch the glass, didn't need to. Her fingers remained steady at her side as she catalogued the details in her mind. The tablecloth was delicate, but the fabric was untouched, unmarred by the break. The liquid had pooled neatly at the base of the glass, but it wasn't just champagne. It was something else, something that had left a trace. A telltale sign. Poison. Miss Marple had seen it before in her years of quiet observation. The evidence often so subtle that others missed it. A bitter taste. Something rare, something deliberate. Someone had planned it. The details of Clarissa's death were coming into focus now. The locked room, the lack of a struggle, and now the poisoned glass. There was a certain elegance in how it had been done, too neat to be an accident. But why? Who stood to gain from her death? She straightened carefully, turning away from the glass, allowing herself a few silent moments to reflect. Clarissa had been a woman at the height of her life, about to marry into the wealth of the Blackwoods, and then there was Jonathan, her husband to be. The image of him standing so stiffly at the altar, his eyes distracted, kept flashing through Miss Marple's mind. Something had been off about him. But there were others. To the best man, Henry Lyle, whose glances toward the bride hadn't been quite as friendly as they should have been. And then, of course, there was the matter of the locked room. Miss Marple's gaze swept over the room once more. Nothing seemed out of place, but everything felt wrong. The suite, though beautifully furnished, was suffocating in its opulence. The velvet curtains were drawn tightly, dimming the last light of the evening. The air in the room was thick with the scent of roses, but there was also that lingering bitter edge. She'd noticed earlier, the perfume now unmistakable in her mind. She took a slow breath, adjusting her glasses. The poison was rare, something used by those who knew what they were doing. Not just anyone could have slipped it into a drink unnoticed, especially in such a crowded room. Clarissa had trusted the hands that passed her that glass, not knowing that one of them held death. The constable was still outside waiting for direction. They would need to act fast, but Miss Marple wasn't in a hurry. She'd seen too many rushed decisions before, too many false leads. The key was always in the smallest detail, the thing that didn't quite fit. She turned back to the glass, examining the residue on the rim. Yes, it was rare. A bitter compound usually reserved for those who didn't want their poison traced easily. It wasn't the kind of thing one could easily purchase from the local apothecary. Miss Marple knew there was more to it, and now she needed to know who had been the most familiar with Clarissa's habits, who had been close enough to get the poison into her glass unnoticed. Her thoughts turned to Henry Lyle again. Had been at the heart of it all, his quiet presence, the unspoken tension between him and Jonathan. Too many things had been left unsaid, too many undercurrents, swirling beneath the surface. But Henry wasn't the only one with a reason. She didn't need to piece it all together just yet, not with details still so fresh, but she could feel the shape of the answer starting to form. In her mind the pieces were aligning, though it wasn't yet clear who would fall. Where Miss Marple's hand hovered over the glass, one last time, her fingers brushing the edge of the lace, the killer had made a mistake. They hadn't covered their tracks well enough, leaving behind that rare tray, and in the end it would be their carelessness that gave them away. She turned away from the table, her mind still racing through the possibilities. The poison had been the key. Someone had brought it to the wedding, someone who had access to the bride, and the opportunity to strike without suspicion. A voice from the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Constable Kane, his face drawn and nervous. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, stepping into the room. "The guests are starting to ask questions. They're getting nervous. Do you think we can?" "Not yet, Miss Marple," said her voice sharp, controlled. "We still have a few things to consider before we make any moves." The constable looked uncertain, but nodded. He had no choice but to trust her judgment with the glass and the poison in mind. Miss Marple felt herself taking another step toward the truth. The wedding had ended, but the real story was just beginning, and whoever had done this had made one fatal error. Miss Marple didn't need to know everything at once, not yet, but she was already certain of one thing: the killer was close, very close, and they had underestimated her. The next morning, St. Mary Me felt as if it were holding its breath, caught somewhere between the whispered rumors of the previous night and the cold reality of the crime that had shattered the usual tranquility of village life. The Blackwood estate was no different. Inside, the once lively halls were silent, now every corner heavy with the weight of Clarissa's death. The guests had departed, but the air was thick with unspoken questions and the tension of unfinished business. Miss Marple, however, had no intention of letting the silence go on much longer. She had seen enough already to know that something didn't sit right about this whole affair, and though no one had asked for her assistance, she had already begun to ask questions of her own. Her first stop was the Blackwood estate's kitchen, where the household staff had begun to stir the pot of gossip and suspicion. The maids were busy, their hands flying over dishes, their eyes darting around to make sure they weren't overheard. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that it wasn't hard to get people to talk, if you knew how to listen, and Miss Marple knew. She slipped quietly into the room, her gray eyes scanning the surroundings with precision. The kitchen was warm, filled with the comforting smell of bread, baking, and fresh tea. It was a place that felt both familiar and hidden, like the secrets it held. "Good morning," Miss Marple said, her voice calm and disarming. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Oh no," Miss Marple said one of the maids, a young woman named Elsie, with a nervous but respectful glance. "We were just tidying up." Another maid, A plump woman, with a face as rounded as the teacups, looked up quickly, and gave a curt nod. "Everything's in order, Miss Mell." Nothing to report, but Miss Marple wasn't fooled. She could see the tension in the way they moved, the tightness around their eyes. It wasn't just the horror of the murder. It was something more personal. Something they weren't saying. "Is it true, Miss Mell," asked casually, "that the bridal suite has a secret door? I've heard that there's a passage leading out of the room." The kitchen fell still. The maids exchanged uncertain glances before Elsie, the younger one, lowered her voice. "We're not supposed to mention it, Miss Mell," she said. "But well, there is a door. We don't know much about it. Only that it's locked, most of the time. The master of the house keeps the key." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, as if considering the information and the key. "But does anyone know where it might be?" The older maid, who had been silent until now, cleared her throat. "There was a key, Miss. I'm not sure where it is now, though. It went missing. Gone missing." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "How odd. I would think something so important would be kept well guarded." The two maids exchanged another glance, this time more pointed. "We don't know what happened to it," Elsie repeated, her voice quieter now. "But it's not in its usual place." Miss Marple paused, her eyes moving across the room, absorbing every detail. The way the maids looked at each other, the little gestures that spoke louder than words. It was clear the key wasn't the only thing that had gone missing. "I see," Miss Marple said, turning to leave. "Thank you, Elsie." "Thank you both." The kitchen returned to its work as Miss Marple moved away, her mind already racing through the implications. A hidden door, a missing key, and someone had used it. The timing was too precise, too clean to be an accident. Whoever had killed Clarissa had known the house well, had known the routes, and had the means to slip out unnoticed. But Miss Marple wasn't finished yet. She had one more stop to make before she would be ready to draw any conclusions. She needed the kind of information that could only be found in the heart of St. Mary, where people's tongues loosened over cups of tea and freshly baked scones. The village tea room was just as Miss Marple had remembered it. Small, cozy, and slightly cramped, with floral wallpaper peeling at the edges. The air was thick with the smell of fresh pastries and warm tea. A handful of regulars sat at the tables, their voices low but insistent, discussing the latest scandal or remarking on the changing of the seasons. The teapot clinked as it was poured, and the clatter of cups provided a steady backdrop to the murmurs of village life. Miss Marple took her usual seat in the corner, her back against the wall, allowing her to watch everyone without being noticed. The tea room was always full of chatter, but the real information was found in the pauses between words. The moments when someone hesitated just a bit too long before speaking, when a glance was exchanged over the rim of a cup. That was when the truth came out today. It didn't take long for Miss Marple to find the clues she needed. There was the conversation she overheard between two of the local women, both of whom had been at the wedding. Their voices dropped when they saw her enter, but the way their eyes shifted gave them away. "I heard the best man was acting strange last night," one of them said, glancing quickly at Miss Marple, before lowering her voice further. "Wouldn't even look at Clarissa. Not once. I think he had something to do with it." The other woman, more hesitant, added, "I don't know about that. But Henry Lee's always been a bit odd, the way he carries on. So quiet. But then there's a certain look he gives people, like he's, I don't know, hiding something." Miss Marple listened, her mind sifting through the words. Henry Lee, Jonathan's best man, had been too quiet, too distant during the wedding. She had noticed that herself. His eyes had lingered on Clarissa a bit too long, and his interactions with Jonathan had been stiff-clipped. Something about him didn't sit right. But then again, who had anything to gain from Clarissa's death? The groom, the best man, or someone entirely different? Miss Marple took a slow sip of tea, her eyes never leaving the two women as they continued their conversation. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were close, but not yet there. They were all dancing around the truth, But Miss Marple knew how to lead them in the right direction. She stood her movement slow and deliberate, as she gathered her things as she made her way to the door. The local gossip died down, only to be replaced by a murmur of curiosity. "I'll need to ask a few more questions," Miss Marple said to herself, softly as she exited the tea room. "But I think we're closer now, much closer." The threads were beginning to weave together, though they were still tangled. The hidden door, the missing key, the strange behavior of Henry, and the mysterious poison in Clarissa's glass. Everything pointed in one direction, though Miss Marple knew better than to jump to conclusions too soon. She'd seen too many cases where things weren't as they seemed, where the obvious answer was the last one to be believed. One thing was certain: the village of St. Mary Maid had a secret, and Miss Marple was going to find it. The morning was still clinging to the last traces of night, a thin veil of fog hanging over St. Mary, like a shroud, keeping the village cloaked in muted gray. Miss Marple had always found something calming in the way the village woke up slowly, never rushed, always deliberate. The cottages with their thatched roofs sat at the edges of the winding lanes as if even they needed time to stretch and yawn before the day began. But there was no calm for Miss Marple. Not today. The puzzle of Clarissa Blackwood's death was too tight, the threads too tangled. She knew the village wasn't as tranquil as it appeared under the neat surface. There were always secrets buried deep. Miss Marple's sharp eyes moved over the garden of the Blackwood estate as she made her way to the back gate. The garden was well kept, but there was an eerie quiet about it, as though even the flowers and trees were aware of the tragedy that had unfolded here. The late morning light broke through the fog in beams, giving the garden a strand ghostly quality. She had learned a great deal in her years of quiet observation, and today she was going to learn more. She wasn't sure where to start, but she knew she had to get closer to the truth, one way or another. It wasn't long before she spotted Mrs. Harris, an elderly woman, who had lived in St. Mary Mid as long as Miss Marple could remember. Mrs. Harris was always around, always keeping an eye on things in her quiet, unassuming way. There was nothing suspicious about her. Not at first glance. She was a regular fixture in the village, a small bent figure in a faded shore, always willing to share the latest gossip or give a soft smile when greeted. "Good morning, Mrs. Harris," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm as she approached the woman near the garden's edge. "You're out early." "As always, oh Miss Marple," Mrs. Harris said with a soft laugh, her hands twisted around the handle of her wicker basket. "The early bird catches the worm, don't you know? Besides, there's no peace to be had with all this fuss going on. I can hardly get my daily chores done with all the talk." Miss Marple nodded in agreement, the corners of her lips twitching upward slightly. "Quite a lot of talk these days, isn't there? I dare see. It's not just about the wedding." Mrs. Harris glanced around as though making sure no one else could hear, before leaning in closer. "Oh, it's more than just that," she said quietly, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You know, Miss Marple, I've seen things, heard things about that house, that bridal suite." Especially Miss Mar's interest piqued, but she didn't let it show. "What sort of things, Mrs. Harris?" The old woman looked around again, her eyes narrowing. "There's a door, miss, a door that oughtn't be there at all. A secret door hidden behind some old tapestries. I've seen it once or twice in my younger days, when I was helping the housekeeper with her chores. It was locked up tight, but I noticed something strange. There was another key, a duplicate one that didn't fit with the regular set." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "A duplicate key?" Now this was something she hadn't heard before. "Really?" Miss Marple asked, her tone still light, though her mind was already working furiously. "And this key, where did it go?" "Mrs. Harris, did anyone else know about it?" Mrs. Harris glanced around once more, her voice dropping to a barely audible whisper. "I've heard tell that it's gone missing now. Never found it, no matter how hard anyone searched. Not that I'm saying it's important, of course, but if you're asking, I think it might have something to do with the goings-on in that room last night. You know Clarissa's death." Miss Marple's lips pressed together, her mind already piecing the puzzle together. A hidden door, a missing key, a locked room where a murder had occurred. The scent of mystery hung in the air just as thick as the fog surrounding the estate. Mrs. Harris had spoken in riddles, but Miss Marple knew better than to ignore even the smallest of details. The missing key, it was no small thing. Well, Miss Marple said, standing up straighter. Thank you for your information, Mrs. Harris. I'll have to think on this a bit more, but I do appreciate you sharing. Mrs. Harris nodded, a small knowing smile on her lips. I don't know if it'll help, Miss Marple, but I thought you should know. Be careful in that house. There's more there than meets the eye. I'll keep that in mind. Miss Marple said. She didn't say anything more, but as she turned and walked away, her mind was already spinning. There was something important here. Something hidden just beneath the surface of Mrs. Harris's casual words. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple found herself back at the village tea room. It was a small, unremarkable place, but it was the hub of village gossip. The walls, covered in faded floral wallpaper, held the scent of old wood and strong tea. The tablecloths were always freshly pressed and the cups were fine, china chipped in places but still elegant. The air was thick with the buzz of conversation, but Miss Marple had no interest in idle chatter. She was here for something more. She was just finishing her tea when she overheard a snippet of conversation that caught her ear. It wasn't intentional. No one ever expected Miss Marple to be listening, but she was used to hearing things that others missed. Have you heard about Henry Lyle? One of the local women was saying to another. The best man at the wedding. Strange fellow, never did like Clarissa much, did he? Oh, I don't think that's true. The other woman replied, her voice quiet but sharp. But he certainly didn't seem happy about the wedding. He spent most of the night alone, didn't he? Miss Marple sipped her tea and kept her gaze focused on the women, her mind working furiously. Henry Le, the best man. He had always seemed too distant, too cold, standing off to the side, his eyes flicking between the bride and the groom. But there had been something else there, something Miss Marple had noticed. Miss Monet before the jealousy, perhaps, but jealousy alone wasn't enough to explain murder. What about the secret passage? The first woman said, her voice lowered almost to a whisper. Some say he knew about it, maybe even used it. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. A secret passage. It wasn't just the missing key. Now this was the piece that tied everything together. Henry Lyle, the odd behavior, the strange passage. No one had ever talked about it. Was all starting to make sense in a way it hadn't before. As the women continued to talk, Miss Marple's mind clicked into place. The key, the passage, the poison, it all led to one conclusion. Henry Lyle knew the house, knew the secrets, and had the means to get into that bridal suite unnoticed. But why? What was his motive? She didn't need to rush. She had the pieces now. Slowly, carefully, she would put together. And when she did, the killer's secret would be exposed for all to see. Miss Marple set her cup down with a soft clink echoed through the dimly lit corridor as Miss Marple's keen eyes caught the subtle shift in her surroundings. A smile tugged at the corners of her lips, ever so slight, yet laced with the satisfaction of a puzzle beginning to take shape. It was all coming together. Soon she would have her answer. Miss Marple was not one to rush. She had long ago learned that hasty conclusions were the folly of the inexperienced, the impatient, or the overly ambitious. No. Real truth required patience, a keen sense of observation, and an understanding of human nature that only time and experience could grant. The murder of Clarissa Blackwood was no different. The evidence had been sparse yet telling, a scattered mosaic of clues that seemed at first glance unrelated. But Miss Marple knew better than to assume. Her method was simple: observe, listen, and when the time was right, piece the fragments together with precision. The Blackwood estate loomed like a silent sentinel against the night, its grand facade concealing the secrets that festered within, while the upper floors dazzled with their gilded decor and regal chandeliers. It was the back corridors that truly intrigued Miss Marple. These were the hidden veins of the house where quiet whispers lingered and long-forgotten truths waited to be uncovered. As she stepped into the passageway, a faint draft carried the scent of aged wood, candle wax, and something more elusive, a trace of damp neglect, as if this part of the house had been abandoned by time itself. The walls, lined with heavy oak paneling, bore the weight of history, their surfaces marred by the passage of years. The narrow hallway stretched before her, its dim lighting casting elongated shadows that flickered like silent phantoms. Her steps were careful, deliberate, the aged floorboards beneath her feet protesting with soft creaks. The servants' quarters lay at the far end of the house, beyond the bustling kitchens where laughter and the clatter of dishes had long since faded into the stillness of the night. Here, the grandeur of Blackwood Estate peeled away, revealing the utilitarian skeleton beneath, the stark contrast between luxury and necessity. Then she saw it, a small alcove nearly swallowed by darkness, tucked away behind a curtain of thick, dust-laden fabric. The wallpaper, once ornate, was now faded and peeling, its intricate patterns lost beneath years of grime. The air was thicker here, as if carrying the weight of secrets left undisturbed. But it was not the decay that caught Miss Marple's attention. It was the wall itself, or rather, the way it was not quite like the others. At the very end of the corridor, where the paneling met the corner, there was something off, a slight indent, too precise to be an accident of architecture. She hesitated only for a moment, before extending her fingers, tracing the surface with the lightest of touches. The wood was smooth, yet beneath her fingertips, she detected the faintest seam. With careful pressure, she pushed. A low groan filled the air as the panel shifted, moving with the reluctant protest of something long forgotten. A door, one that should not have been there. Miss Marple narrowed her eyes, her breath steady despite the thrill of discovery. The hidden passage revealed itself inch by inch, its presence a silent testament to the house's buried history. Whoever had built this had done so with careful intent, ensuring it blended seamlessly into the rest of the estate's design. It was not meant to be found, yet here it was. And more importantly, here she was. Her mind worked swiftly, connecting the pieces, the locked room, the missing key, the clues that had thus far resisted alignment. But now the picture was beginning to take shape. This passage led directly to the upper floors, specifically to the bridal suite, the very room where Clarissa Blackwood had met her untimely end. Miss Marple inhaled slowly. This changed everything. Whoever had killed Clarissa had known about this passage. Whether it had been part of their escape or a means to enter unnoticed, one thing was certain: only someone intimately familiar with the house's layout could have used it to their advantage. And that meant the killer was not an outsider. No, this was someone from within the house. Someone who had moved through these walls with confidence, with purpose. The truth was no longer a distant puzzle. It was right here, within reach. Miss Marple stepped back, the weight of revelation settling in her bones. The secrets of Blackwood Estate were unraveling, and with them so too would the murderer's carefully constructed illusion. It was only a matter of time. More to be done before she could take this discovery to the constables. There was still the matter of the key. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the window sill beside the hidden door, where a small object caught her attention. It was a tarnished key, carelessly left on the dusty surface. Its shape was familiar, even in its dull state. Miss Mel's fingers hovered over it, and then she reached for the key, turning it over in her hand. The design was unmistakable. The key was identical to those kept in the estate's secure box, the set that had been used to lock doors to control access to private rooms. The fact that it had been abandoned here in such an unguarded place was significant. This key had been deliberately placed just as the passage had been deliberately concealed. Whoever had used it had intended to make sure the crime would be difficult to trace. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around the key as she absorbed the weight of this new piece of the puzzle. The key wasn't just a key. It was a message, a clue left behind in plain sight for anyone who cared to look carefully enough, and Miss Marple always cared to look carefully later in the quiet of her study. Miss Marple sat at the small wooden desk that had become her thinking place. A sheet of paper lay before her, and with a pencil in hand, she began to sketch a rough map of the estate. She drew the hidden passage, noting its proximity to the bridal suite, marking the location of the servants' quarters, and adding the small concealed door she had just discovered. The lines and curves of the house began to take shape on the page, and slowly as the connections clicked into place, murder itself began to unfold. The locked room, the inn key, the passage through which the killer could have easily bypassed any lock, any obstacle. It was too convenient, too perfect, but it wasn't the design of the house that had made the crime possible. It was the person who knew the house so intimately, someone who had access to the servants' areas, who had knowledge of the hidden door, and crucially who had known about the bridal suite. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, a quiet smile touching the corners of her lips. She had seen it now, the shape of the crime. She knew the how, the where, and the when. All that remained was the who, and once she had that answer, the murderer would be trapped as surely as a mouse caught in a trap. She folded her notepad, careful not to crease the paper, and stood up. There was still work to be done, but she was no longer searching blindly. The pattern had emerged, and with it, the truth. It was just a matter of time before the pieces fell into place. The study in Blackwood Manor was a room cloaked in shadows, the rich mahogany furniture too polished to be comforting, too carefully placed to be lived in. Jonathan Blackwood sat at his desk, his fingers pressed lightly against the surface as though keeping a grip on something unseen, something fragile. The air was thick, heavy with the grief he had been carrying since the morning of his wife's death. Miss Marple had observed him from the moment she stepped through the door, noticing the way his jaw clenched and how he avoided meeting her eyes for too long. It wasn't so much a mourning widow's look as it was a man bracing against the weight of his own thoughts. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low and controlled, but there was a slight tremor like a string pulled too tight. "Mr. Blackwood," she replied, taking a seat in the chair across from him. There was no need for pleasantries. The air between them was already thick with unspoken things. "I assume you're here to ask questions," he said after a pause. "That's my job, Mr. Blackwood," Miss Marple replied, simply, her voice calm, her eyes sharp as ever. "And you've already done your part by offering your cooperation." Jonathan looked away, his gaze drifting out the window, but it didn't seem to land anywhere. He shifted in his seat, looking both rigid and defeated at the same time. "I don't know what you think happened, Miss Marple," Jonathan began, his voice breaking. Slightly he cleared his throat, regaining his composure. "I loved Clarissa. She was the light of my life. She didn't deserve this. None of it makes sense. Love is a curious matter. Isn't it, Mr. Blackwood?" Miss Marple said, her tone carefully neutral. "Sometimes it brings us joy, other times pain, and occasionally, as in your case, a few secrets." Jonathan froze, his expression stiffening. His eyes flicked to hers for the briefest of moments before he looked away, his lips pressing tight together. "Secrets?" His voice was barely above a whisper, a tremor still lurking. "There, you've known her for years," Miss Marple said, her gaze never leaving him. "And there's always more to people than meets the eye. Clarissa, despite her beauty, had a way of hiding things. Didn't she?" Jonathan shifted again, and the tension in his posture grew palpable. "We had our problems, but that's private, Miss Marple." He rubbed his face with his hand, a grimace spreading across his features. "I loved her. Don't know who could have." He stopped himself before finishing the thought, swallowing hard. Miss Marple watched him with the same calm intensity. "You loved her, but love, Mr. Blackwood, can make people do strange things. It's a powerful emotion. Sometimes it causes people to make decisions they regret." Jonathan's gaze darkened, but his voice remained steady. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that sometimes, Mr. Blackwood, the people who were closest to us, well, they're the ones who know our secrets and the ones who can hurt us the most," Miss Marple said quietly, her eyes narrowing just slightly. Jonathan recoiled at her words, a flush creeping up his neck. The silence between them thickened, then in a tone that barely resembled the man who had stood at the altar with his bride, Just days ago. He said, I didn't kill her, Miss Marple. I loved her. Miss Marple nodded as if she had already made up her mind about his involvement. She rose slowly from her seat, her movements deliberate, unhurried. I believe you, Mr. Blackwood, but we'll see if your love was enough to shield her from someone else's pain. With that she left the study, her eyes lingering for a moment longer on the man who had once been a husband, but now seemed more like a ghost of a man, haunted by his own desires and regrets. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple found herself wandering the village's rose garden, the soft scent of flowers in the air, and the distant hum of life going on around her. The garden was quiet now, save for a few of the local children running through the hedges, and yet it was impossible for Miss Marple to ignore the atmosphere. Heavy charred, there was something about this place that felt like it was hiding more than it let on. As she walked down one of the narrow paths lined with roses, she spotted Henry Lyle, standing alone, his hands deep in his pockets, his face tilted upward, as if trying to find some clarity in the sky. The facade of the jovial best man from the wedding day was gone. What remained was a man, lost his entire demeanor, sagging under the weight of something guilt. Perhaps Miss Marple approached him slowly, her footsteps soft on the gravel. She had been waiting for this moment, sensing that the answer she sought lay not in the words he spoke, but in how he reacted to her presence. Mr. Lee, she greeted him, her voice polite, but carrying an edge of something more, a quiet place to reflect. Is it not? Henry turned, his expression momentarily flickering with recognition before returning to a neutral, almost practiced look. Miss Marple, he said, his voice steady, but lacking the warmth it had held when they had spoken at the wedding. I didn't expect to see you out here looking for answers. I suppose always looking, Mr. Lee, Miss Marple replied, a smile, small, but knowing. You know, love is a curious thing, isn't it? Henry flinched just slightly, and his gaze faltered, a sharp fleeting break in his usual composure. He recovered quickly, but Miss Marple had seen it. He had lost control of his guard for just a second. That split second of vulnerability was enough to tell her everything she needed to know. Love, he echoed, his voice tight, as if the word itself had made him uncomfortable. It's a strange thing. Yes, Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. I would say you know more about it than most, Mr. Lyle. You've been quite close to Clarissa, haven't you? His hand twitched in his coat pocket, but he didn't speak. He looked out toward the village, as if searching for something in the distance. The garden, the quiet seemed to press in around them, stifling, oppressive. You were her confidant, weren't you? Miss Marple continued, her tone casual, but there was an undertone of something much sharper. It must have been difficult seeing her marry someone else, knowing you could never have her the way you wanted. A flicker of regret, real regret, not the feigned kind, crossed Henry's face. Mouth opened slightly, as if to speak, but no words came out. The silence stretched between them, and Miss Marple allowed it to hang there, giving him room to think, to reveal what he couldn't say out loud. She had no need to press further. The cracks were starting to show, and they were enough when he finally spoke. His voice was lower, quieter, filled with a sorrow. Miss Marple didn't need to fake sympathy, for I never wanted to hurt her. But sometimes we do things we shouldn't, when we can't have what we want. He met her gaze then, his eyes filled with something raw, guilt, certainly, but also something darker. Miss Marple's eyes softened slightly, but she didn't respond right away. The pieces were falling into place. It wasn't just about love, it was about loss, and the lengths a person would go to when they felt that loss was too much to bear. You loved her, Miss Marple said, a voice, almost a whisper, as though she was speaking to herself. But it was too late, wasn't it? Henry's lips pressed tight, his face crumpling just slightly, before he forced himself to stand taller. You don't know what you're talking about, Miss Marple. I think I do, she replied quietly, her voice calm and steady. But you're right, Mr. Lyle. Sometimes love is a curious thing. As she walked away from the garden, The answer was clearer than ever. The wedding, the bride, the best man, everything had been a carefully constructed stage. But like all carefully crafted lies, it was beginning to unravel. The house was still, the kind of stillness that crept through the walls, thickening the air and pressing down on the shoulders of anyone inside the Blackwood estate. For all its grandeur had a suffocating cull. Iddy at times its high ceilings, its long echoing halls, its vast rooms filled with costly antiques, all of it gave the place the feel of something out of reach. And yet the secrets of the house were not as hidden as its owners would have liked to believe. Miss Marple, ever observant, had grown accustomed to the weight of silence. She had learned long ago that some things were best left unsaid, especially when most significant truths were spoken in whispers. And it was in one such whisper, overheard in a shadowy corridor of the Blackwood estate, that a new possibility emerged. One that made the already complex web of motives surrounding Clarissa Blackwood's death even more tangled. She had been walking through the hall when she heard it, the soft murmur of voices too hushed to carry, but not quite soft enough to escape her hearing. She paused, standing still in the shadows where the low light couldn't reach her eyes, narrowing as she focused on the words drifting from the crack in the door ahead. "You can't just walk away from this, Clarissa." A man's voice, low and insistent, said. Miss Marple recognized it immediately. Henry Lye, the best man, the one who had played his role too well during the wedding. His voice, usually calm and collected, now trembled with emotion, was a vulnerability that he rarely showed. She was not close enough to catch the next words, but the tone was unmistakable. There was fear. Fear and something else, something darker. "Henry," pleased. Clarissa's voice, high and tight, trembled as if trying to maintain control. We've both known what this is. I'm married. Now there's no turning back." Her words hung in the air like a heavy scent. Miss Marple's mind worked quickly, piecing together the fragments. Then a secret affair. Clarissa, the beautiful bride, had been involved with someone other than her groom, and Henry, her best man, was the other side of the triangle. Miss Marple took a step forward, listening carefully to the conversation that was unfolding just beyond her reach. "No." Henry K's voice broke the silence again. "I won't be left in the dark any longer. You can't." His words cut off abruptly, and for a moment all that Miss Marple could hear was the soft rustle of fabric, as if someone had stepped closer, perhaps trying to keep the exchange private. She leaned in just a fraction, and then she heard the quietest of sighs. "I never meant for this to happen," Clarissa's voice said, almost pleading. "I never wanted to hurt you, but Jonathan, he's my husband. Now I've made my choice." Another long pause. Then Henry, his voice tinged with both anger and regret, spoke again. "You don't get to choose who you love. Clarissa, you can pretend all you like, but you and we both know this isn't over. Not by a long shot." There was the sound of a door creaking open, followed by the shuffle of feet as the conversation was cut short. Miss Marple took a step back, her breath steady. The whispers faded, leaving behind the unmistakable weight of a secret, and the unbearable tension of unspoken words. A love triangle. But not one of the usual kind. This was something more volatile. Something much harder to unravel. The motives had just expanded: greed, jealousy, and the desperate need to possess what wasn't his. Henry's desperation was now as clear as Clarissa's hesitance, and the man in the equation who had seemed the least affected, Jonathan, now stood at the center of a storm that had nothing to do with him, and everything to do with the lies and the fears hiding in plain sight. Miss Marple took a deep breath, letting the gravity of what she had overheard settle over her. This was more than just a tragic love story. It was a story of betrayal and loss, where the boundaries between right and wrong had blurred, leaving a trail of casualties in its wake. As Miss Marple walked down the corridor, she felt the weight of the mystery press down harder than before. The puzzle pieces, once scattered and vague, were now beginning to form something darker. Confession without words, a tragedy without a simple explanation. When she reached the study where Jonathan had been earlier, she paused at the door. It was the right moment to revisit him, to draw out the last piece of the puzzle. Miss Marple was certain of one thing now: the secret wasn't just hidden in the room where Clarissa had died. It was buried deep in the hearts of those closest to her, and before the day was done, Miss Marple would ensure that it was brought into the light. She pushed the door open, the creak of the hinges sounding louder than usual. Jonathan was still sitting at his desk, staring at the empty space in front of him. He didn't look up at first, but when he heard her footsteps he finally lifted his eyes. A trace of something unreadable crossing his features. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of too many unspoken truths back again. "So soon? There's always more to uncover." "Mr. Blackwood," Miss Marple replied quietly, stepping into the room, "sometimes the truth is far more complicated than it appears." His lips pressed into a tight line, and Miss Marple could see the familiar tension in his posture. But she wasn't here to press him for answers, at least not directly. She was here to give him the space to speak, to let the cracks show. "It's not just about Clarissa, is it?" Miss Marple asked, her tone casual but laden with meaning. "It's about what you were willing to overlook, about the people in your life and what they were willing to hide from you." Jonathan's eyes narrowed and his hand tightened around the pen on his desk, the knuckles white. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but Miss Marple could hear the hesitation in his voice. "You don't have to say it," she replied, "but the truth will find a way to slip out, eventually." "Mr. Blackwood." As Jonathan looked away, Miss Marple's mind was already shifting. Henry's confession had been a whisper in the dark, but it had already echoed loudly enough to be heard. The puzzle was falling into place, but the final pieces remained elusive. There were more secrets yet to be uncovered, and Miss Marple would get to them all. But the silence of the estate had changed. It wasn't just the walls that had secrets now. It was the people themselves, and Miss Marple was the one who would uncover them, no matter how many whispered confessions. It took. The soft ticking of the clock was the only sound in the room, steady and regular. As Miss Marple sat in the worn armchair by the window, the evening had drawn in early, the light fading behind the thick drapes, leaving the room in shadows. The room itself was a reflection of its owner, neat, comfortable, with just enough clutter to give it character. A few books sat piled on the small table beside her, their pages worn from years of reading. But it was the papers spread across her lap that held her focus now. Her sharp eyes scanned the notes she had taken over the past few days, her mind retracing each step, each word, each glance exchanged. The pieces were almost all there. She could feel the answers slipping into place like the last fragments of a shattered vase, finally being put together. It was the quiet kind of satisfaction that came with solving a puzzle that no one else had seen. A subtle smile toed at the corners of her lips, and as if she were already one step ahead of the people who still believed. This was a mystery without an answer. Clarissa Blackwood's murder was not random. It had been carefully planned, meticulously executed, and most importantly, it had been motivated by something far deeper than what was visible on the surface. Miss Marple's eyes flicked over the papers again, the timeline of events, the descriptions of the hidden passage, the duplicate key found in the servants' quarters. She tapped the pencil lightly against her notepad, her mind sorting through the clutter of facts. It was there in the details that the truth often revealed itself. The door to her study creaked open slightly, but Miss Marple didn't look up. She knew who it was without needing to ask. It was her cat, Jasper, padding quietly across the room, his fur brushing against the floor with the softest of sounds. She smiled faintly, still lost in her thoughts, as she absent-mindedly reached down to scratch his ears. The feline seemed to approve, curling up on the rug by the fire. As Miss Marple's mind continued to work, racing over the details of the case, the poison had been rare, difficult to get, yet there. It was placed deliberately in the champagne glass, a foreign substance chosen carefully for its specific effect. It had been no mistake. Someone had known exactly what they were doing. The key, the hidden door, the access to the bridal suite. All of it pointed to one person. Miss Marple's gaze lifted to the small map she had drawn earlier. It was crude, hurried in its execution, but the key pieces were clear. The servants' quarters, the bridal suite, and the hidden passage. The duplicate key had been the key literally, and figuratively. Henry Lyle. He had known the house too well to be just a bystander, a witness to the events of the evening. A flash of insight struck Miss Marple, the pieces of the puzzle snapping into place with a clarity that made her smile a little too knowingly. Henry Lyle hadn't just been the best man, he had been the secret lover, the hidden force behind Clarissa's tragic death. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment. The sound of the ticking clock seemed louder, now, as if it were the only thing keeping her anchored to the presence. She could almost hear the echo of the conversation she had overheard in the Blackwood estate, the whispered words between Henry and Clarissa, the unspoken jealousy and regret hanging heavy in the air. She could hear Henry's desperation, his need to possess what he couldn't have. The timeline was simple, almost painfully. So Clarissa, in her attempt to escape a relationship she had likely outgrown, had made the mistake of turning to Henry for comfort. It had started out as a simple affair, but Henry, driven by an overwhelming possessiveness, had wanted more. When Clarissa had chosen to marry Jonathan, the wealth and status that came with him pulling her away from Henry's grasp, the jealousy had festered, souring whatever affection had once been there. The missing key had given Henry the perfect opportunity to act. He knew the house better than anyone, from its secret corridors to its locked doors. The bridal suite, the one place where Clarissa should have been safe, was vulnerable to his reach. The poison chosen to mimic an accident had been placed with precise care. The scene had been set, the locked door, the missing key, the absence of any sign of forced entry. The perfect crime. It wasn't love that had driven Henry Lyle, Miss Marple realized it. Was possession, a desire to control what was no longer his. Clarissa's rejection had been more than just a heartbreak. It had been a blow to his fragile ego. And when she chose Jonathan, when she committed to a life he could never have, he had seen no other option but to eliminate the obstacle. Miss Marple leaned forward, a pencil, tapping the paper with a rhythmic, almost meditative sound. It was all coming together now. Every clue, pointing to the same inevitable conclusion. The missing key, the secret passage, the exotic poison, and the man who had everything to lose. Henry Lyle was the murderer, yet there was still something about him that Miss Marple couldn't quite place. The guilt, the desperation, the way his facade cracked when confronted with his feelings for Clarissa. It had been too much for him to handle. A quiet murmur slipped from Miss Marple's lips, her eyes narrowing with the faintest hint of satisfaction. It was not the obvious that was key, she murmured to herself, her voice barely a whisper, but the hidden paths of the heart. Her mind briefly drifted back to the quiet confession she had overheard. In the garden, the broken man standing in front of Clarissa, pleading for what was never meant to be the same man who had come into her life, stolen her affection, and eventually taken it all away. When he couldn't have it, he had wanted to claim her even in death, as if love could be won at any cost. But in the end it was his obsession that had sealed his fate. The eureka moment was quiet, subtle, and satisfying all at once. Miss Marple's fingers slowly closed around the notepad, her eyes lifting to the faint glow of the dying fire in the hearth. The pieces had fallen into place. She had solved the puzzle now. It was only a matter of time before the truth was uncovered. The village hall in St. Mary Me was an unremarkable building set apart from the charming stone cottages and the vibrant flower gardens that decorated the main street. It was a modest structure with thick wooden beams overhead and creaky floorboards beneath. The air, Inside was heavy with the scent of old books and polished furniture, and the rustic decor, though dignified, felt somehow out of place for the kind of gathering that had been called the usual hum of village life. The clink of teacups, the chatter of gossip had been replaced by the quiet murmur of anxious voices. The suspect specks were gathered seated in a semicircle, each of them tense, eyes darting from one to another, their faces unreadable save for the occasional shift in posture or nervous glance. Miss Marple stood before them, her hands folded neatly in front of her, as calm as ever. Her sharp, knowing gaze swept over the group, measuring each one in turn. This was the moment, the time to bring it all together, to reveal the tangled web of emotions, secrets and motives that had led to Clarissa Blackwood's death. And though it was far from Miss Marple's first such moment, the tension in the room was palpable. Even the thick walls of the hall seemed to press in the air, thick with unspoken words and suspicion. Jonathan Blackwood sat near the front, his face pale, but composed, his hands resting tightly in his lap. Beside him was Henry Lye, the best man, his demeanor more rigid than usual. His eyes, once warm and confident, now appeared almost hollow, as if the weight of the truth was beginning to bear down on him. The rest of the group, staff members, distant relatives, friends of the bride, sat behind them, shifting in their seats, waiting for Miss Mel to speak. The room held its breath. Miss Marple moved forward, her steps slow, but sure. She had no need to rush. The game was already afoot, and she knew the rules better than anyone. The faces before her were masks, some hiding guilt, others confusion, but all carrying the same weight, the knowledge that their lives, for better or worse, had been shaped by the events of that night. Ladies and gentlemen, Miss Marple began, her voice steady, cutting through the room with quiet authority. I asked you all here today because there are things that need to be addressed, things that have been hidden under the guise of grief and confusion. She paused, letting the words settle. You may be wondering how I came to my conclusions, how from a collection of facts I can stand here and tell you the truth behind the death of Clarissa Blackwood. Her eyes flicked briefly to Jonathan. Henry, though she spoke to the room at large. But as I've learned over the years, the truth is never as simple as it seems. It hides in the smallest details, the things that are easy to overlook. She turned then to the table at the side of the room, where a series of sketches and notes lay carefully arranged. Her hands, steady despite the gravity of the moment, moved to point at a series of diagrams, simple but revealing the first piece of the puzzle. Is the bridal suite, Miss Marple continued, her voice calm but firm. The room where Clarissa Blackwood died was locked from the inside, as you all know. At first glance, it seemed impossible. A locked room mystery, you might say, but as with all such mysteries, the answer was simpler than it appeared. A quiet murmur spread through the room, but Miss Marple ignored it. She pointed at a diagram of the manor, specifically a narrow corridor leading behind the walls of the estate, hidden from view. Behind this wall, she said, was a passage leading directly to the servants' quarters, a concealed route that, unbeknownst to most, had been hidden for years, and it was through this passage that our murderer gained access. The group stirred, but Miss Marple was far from finished. Now let's talk about the key, she said, her eyes narrowing. A duplicate key to the bridal suite, a key that shouldn't have existed, was found in a place where it shouldn't have been. She turned toward Henry Lyle, her gaze sharp. A key that led directly to the hidden door, a key that matched those used by the staff of the house. Henry shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Miss Marple wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the rest of the group, watching their reactions. She knew what each of them thought, knew what each of them feared. The duplicate key was the key, Miss Mel continued. It wasn't an accident. It was no careless mistake. Someone with intimate knowledge of the house, someone who knew about the hidden roots, had deliberately set up the scene, and that someone was none other than Henry Lyle. The room was silent. For a moment, the air had thickened, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the next word. But Miss Marple wasn't finished. You see, she said slowly, Henry Lyle had a motive, one that many of you might have missed. Love, you would say, but I would argue, it was more than that. It was jealousy and something darker still. Possession. Clarissa Blackwood was not just a woman to him. She was an object, something to be claimed, to be held in his grasp. But when she chose Jonathan, when she married him, Henry lost control. Jonathan shifted in his seat at the mention of his name, his fingers tightening on the armrest. Miss Marple ignored him, pressing on. Clarissa had rejected him. And while he played the part of the loyal best man, Henry Lyle had been carrying the burden of a secret relationship that would never come to fruition, a relationship he wanted to keep, even if it meant destroying everything in his path. Her voice softened, almost apologetic, as she turned to Jonathan and Jonathan Blackwood. Miss Marple said, her eyes meeting his for the first time, was not entirely blameless. His blindness to his wife's affair, his failure to see the truth in front of him, only made things worse. He had the means, the opportunity, but he didn't have the will. Henry, on the other hand, was prepared to go to any lengths. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the others in the room, her gaze cutting through the tension, like a knife. The poison, the key, the hidden passage, it all aligns perfectly. And when Clarissa finally chose to marry Jonathan, Henry was left with no option but to act. His jealousy was more than just a reaction. It was a decision made in cold blood. She stepped back, letting her words sink in the silence, in the room thickening. Miss Marple's voice dropped to a near whisper, as she concluded, it was not love that drove him. It was the desire to possess something he could never truly have. Jonathan's face drained of color, his lips trembling as though the weight of the truth had hit him all at once. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words died in his throat. And Henry was the first to break. His hands clenched into fists, his eyes wilded with a mixture of fear and anger. He stood, his chair scraping against the floor, as he looked around the room, his face twisted with emotion. You don't know anything, Henry said, his voice rising, shaking with a mix of rage and desperation. You don't understand. She was mine. She was always mine. Miss Marple took a step back, her expression unchanged, and let the storm pass. The room was still. The silence, louder now than ever before. The pieces had all fallen into place. Miss Marple smiled to herself, just slightly, the faintest hint of satisfaction playing at the corners of her lips. The drawing room of Blackwood Manor was smaller than the grandeur of the house suggested, yet it still held an air of overwhelming opulence. The walls were lined with rich tapestries, their faded colors competing with a gleam of silver. Framed portraits that lined the edges of the room. A large fireplace, now cold, dominated one side, the ashes of last night's fire barely stirring under the grate. It was a room built for conversation, but tonight it was heavy with the unsaid. Miss Marple stood at the center of it, her hands folded in front of her, as she had done so many times before. Her gray eyes flickered over the assembled group, the faces before her, a mix of confusion, frustration and fear. They were all there. Jonathan Blackwood, Henry Lyle, the remaining guests and staff, each of them had been brought together by the web of lies and jealousy spun over days, months and even years. The atmosphere in the room was thick, each of them seemingly holding their breath, unsure of what to expect next. Miss Marple had said little, allowing the silence to do its work. Now she was ready to make her move. Her eyes landed on Henry Lyle, still standing rigidly near the door, trying to keep his composure. Miss Marple's sharp gaze never left him. He had been the key all along, the one who had been hiding in plain sight. And now she was ready to unravel the carefully woven threads of his lies. It seems, Mr. Henry, Miss Marple said, her voice steady but carrying an edge of accusation, that love unreturned can turn as bitter as the most potent poison. The words seemed to hang in the air like a tow string, stretching tight before snapping. Henry's face, usually composed, flickered with a barely perceptible change. A slight twitch of his jaw, a sharp inhalation, His eyes, once cool, guarded, now betrayed the guilt that had been hidden so carefully for so long. There was a collective shift in the room. Every person in it seemed to take a step back, as though an invisible barrier had been crossed, one he had desperately hoped would remain intact. His hand twitched at his side, a reflex he couldn't suppress, but he forced himself to remain still. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing into slits, as he studied Miss Marple with something that teetered between defiance and fear. "You're mad," he finally said, his voice sharp but with a waver that betrayed him. There's no truth in this. You can't possibly," Miss Marple interrupted, her voice slicing through his denial like a razor. "You loved her, Mr. Henry." A hush fell over the room. Every breath, every shift of fabric as the others stood frozen, waiting, felt amplified in the thick silence. Miss Marple took a step forward, her gaze locked onto him with unwavering precision. "But your love was not a love of kindness, was it? It was not the love of a man who cherishes. It was the love of a man who possesses, who controls." Henry K's breath hitched, his lips parted, as if to protest, but no words came. "You knew," Miss Marple continued, her voice unshaken, deliberate. "Deep down you always knew. Clarissa could never love you the way you wanted her to. Not when her heart belonged to another. Not when she had already chosen Jonathan." Her words landed like hammer blows against a fragile surface, each one deepening the cracks. The murmur that had begun rippling through the room, the gasps, the whispers, the stolen glances was silenced with nothing more than a simple firm gesture of Miss Marple's hand. "She wasn't finished. The poison," she said, her voice steady, yet carrying the weight of inevitability. "You didn't just stumble upon it. No, Mr. Henry, you chose it, deliberately. A rare bitter substance, one that would dissolve without suspicion, one that would leave no obvious trace." Henry K. swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He clenched his fists, knuckles white. The candlelight flickered against his damp skin, catching the sheen of sweat now forming at his temple. Miss Marple tilted her head, watching him with the patient curiosity of a hunter who had finally ensnared its prey. "It was perfect, wasn't it? Precise, almost elegant in its simplicity. A plan executed with the cold calculation of a man who believed he was too clever to be caught." A flicker of something crossed Henry K's face. Shock, anger, regret. It was fleeting, but it was there. And in that moment, Miss Marple knew. She had him. "You used the duplicate key." She let the statement settle, as if giving him the chance to deny it, though she knew he wouldn't. "You knew about the secret passage, the one that links the servants' quarters to the bridal suite, the passage that allowed you to slip in and out, unseen, unheard. No one would have suspected a thing." The air in the room was suffocating now, thick with the weight of revelation. Henry K's gaze darted around seeking escape. His fingers fumbled at his collar, as though the very fabric of his clothes had begun to suffocate him. "You're a fool," he spat. But the words lacked conviction. They were hollow, brittle, already crumbling before they had fully left his lips. "I didn't kill her. You have no proof." A thin, knowing smile curled at Miss Marple's lips, yet there was no warmth in it. "Proof," she repeated, almost amused. "Proof is merely the final detail, Mr. Henrique. The truth, however, has a way of surfacing whether you like it or not." Henry Case inhaled sharply, his entire body wound tight as a coiled spring. "You're wrong," he whispered. But the fight was slipping. His own voice betrayed him. Miss Marple shook her head, her tone softer now, not out of mercy, but out of understanding. "The key, Mr. Henry," she said. "The key was your mistake." The silence that followed was deafening. Henry K. flinched, his face paling as though he had been struck. "You never intended for it to be found, did you?" she continued, almost gently now. "But it was. And that, Mr. Henry Case, is where your plan unraveled." His breath came in short, shallow gasps. His shoulders slumped, his entire frame seeming to shrink beneath the weight of his own undoing. She was never supposed to. He stopped, as if realizing too late that he had said too much. "No," Miss Marple said softly, her voice carrying the finality of a closing door. "Clarissa was never yours. Not in the way you wanted her to be." Henry K's lips trembled, his eyes darted to the floor, his body sagging under the crushing truth. "And that," she said, "is what drove you to do it, isn't it? Love, unreturned, twisting, festering, turning to bitterness, until all that was left was the need to control her. And when you realized you could not have her, you sought to ensure that no one else would either." Henry K's legs seemed to give way slightly beneath him. He gripped the back of a chair, his breath ragged. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The fight had drained out of him like water from a broken glass. He was cornered, and he knew it. The room remained still, every person within it, watching in stunned silence as the moment stretched thick with unspoken truth. Henry K's edged slowly, shaking his head, a quiet, almost bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Clever old woman," he muttered, almost to himself. Miss Marple's expression did not change. She merely watched unblinking, as the final piece of the puzzle fell into place.